So yeah, it's a pleasure to have our next speaker. Yash Kanoria is also a colleague from Columbia University at the business school. And he's also apparently at Amazon right now. And he will talk about dynamic spatial matchings today.
Thank you for the introduction and thank you for the invitation to this wonderful workshop. Thank you all for coming. Yeah, so I'm on sabbatical. So though my home is Colombia, right now I'm at Amazon for a year and it's quite fun. So I'm doing supply chain optimization there. Somebody asked me what's the connection? Are you using this in Amazon? This is a hard question. Maybe in some indirect way. But this work actually, so for me, it's close to my heart. It goes back to things that I've been working on in some form for more than a decade. Not continuously, but in some form. It has been sort of gestating for a long time. So I'm excited to share where we've gotten with this. This is work with my esteemed co-authors. Yilun Chen was a postdoc with me, and he just started as a faculty member at CUHK Shenzhen. Akshit Kumar is a PhD student at Columbia, so he's a main person driving this agenda forward. And Omar Bezbez is a colleague at Columbia. Okay, so there's a number of applications that motivate this type of study. One set of one sort of whole bunch of inspiration is coming from ride hailing. You can think of this as dynamic matching in typically two-dimensional space, and the supply and demand both live in this two-dimensional space. They will come online, both sides come online dynamically, they're matched, they go off and do their thing. Next set of demand and supply come in. So this is sort of dynamic on both sides. You have a number of other matching platforms that also serve as inspiration. Here you can think maybe the supply is coming in beforehand, it's more of a sort of static thing, and the demand comes in dynamically and needs to be matched. The space here, so if you think of a lodging kind of setting, the space for the supply units might correspond to their location, to the size, to the amenities, the price, and so on. So there are dimensions for each of these different attributes. And the demand has also, the demand units are these customers, they also have preferences over these different attributes. So they also live in a space with the same number of dimensions. Okay, so we will talk about a model later, which will be inspired particularly by these types of matching platforms, Airbnb and Upwork kinds of platforms. And I come from operations. So network revenue management is this whole set of problems. And traditionally, we've been thinking about models where there is a certain small number of supply types and or resources and a small number of demand types. And we let the number of customers scale up, but keep those number of types small. Increasingly, this may not be a good model of things that are actually going on. So now I'm at Amazon and our customers are in tens of thousands of different zip codes. They may have other dimensions of heterogeneity as well. So you have many, many types, and you want to be able to say something about how to make your decisions in that type of situation as well. Okay, so at a high level, there are going to be two kinds of questions. So one is, how large are the costs that you have to bear that arise due to this spatial heterogeneity, right, in demand and supply, as well as the uncertainty about the future that is inherent when you have to match dynamically. Static matching we know how to solve, right? But dynamic matching, you kind of you have some forecast about the future, but you don't know exactly what's going to come in, and it's also an algorithmic challenge. Okay, so that brings us to this the second main question, which is how to do the matching in a dynamic setting. So we are going to focus on scaling behavior of this matching cost. It will be related to matching distance. We are going to look at the scaling behavior with the market thickness as a function of the dimension D. And I will not be concerned with constant factors and so on for the theoretical results. This was just at a very high level. So I'm going to be talking about basically these three pieces of work. A sort of high-level differentiator of this first paper that I'll talk about is that it's supposed to set some theoretical foundation, and we're going to assume that the demand and supply spatial distributions are the same. Okay, so the only thing bothering us will be the spatial stochasticity, and this is where the costs are going to arise from as well. Okay, there's going to be less of an algorithmic question there. There is some algorithm that I'll need to use to be able to get positive results, but it's more about just quantifying these costs that arise as a function of the nature of the dynamics and the number of dimensions. And then we have a couple more pieces of work which are getting closer to specific application domains, where in particular we will allow the distributions, the spatial distributions of demand and supply to be different from each other. Okay, and try to model certain aspects of applications. First, we'll talk about matching platforms. The other one is going to come from revenue management. So let's dive into the first paper here. And by the way, I haven't put a huge amount of material, so please interrupt me. We can have a discussion, and I'll take questions throughout the talk. Okay, so a sort of gentle warm up. We are going to have supply and demand located in the unit hypercube in d dimensions, and we are going to assume that these are coming from a uniform distribution, and in particular we notice that this distribution is same for supply and demand, right? We're going to try to minimize the cost, which is the expected average match distance. This distance, let's think of it as the Euclidean distance. Any Minkowski distance is going to behave the same because we won't care about constant factors. Okay, this uniform distribution assumption is easy to generalize, but right now we are assuming that the two distributions are the same. Okay, so we just had lunch. So now let me throw a riddle your way.
Yes.
Yes.
So you're not asking what does this cost? All right. Asking question is it online?
Yeah, we are going to have online models, but this warm up right now, the first question I ask you will be a static question. Yeah, but the interest is in dynamic models. The static models were studied in the 80s and early 90s, and there are some classic papers. We just try to catch up a little bit with that static intuition. So the question is the following. Right, so I have n supply units located IID uniformly in, let's say, two-dimensional space, right, in this two-dimensional square, and I don't reveal the location of that supply. I just say, hey, here is a demand unit. What is the expected distance of the nearest supply unit to this demand unit? And in particular, what is the scaling of this nearest supply unit with n? Right, is it 1 upon n? Is it 1 upon n squared?
1D 1 upon n.
1D is 1 upon n. Good. Yeah, perfect. So good. So the answer, Sanjay got it right. It's 1 upon square root n. Okay.
Yeah.
Because it's just spatial balls and pins, right? It just
And it has to be worse than.
Yeah, it can't be like even closer than like 1D, right?
Oh yeah, annoying with this idea. Okay, that's great. So Balu's like, how can it be 1 upon n?
Yeah.
It has to be larger than 1 upon n. So now we are asking for proximity along two dimensions, not just one dimension. And in particular, it's 1 upon square root n. One way to see it is that if I have a ball with a radius 1 upon square root n, the volume of that ball, meaning the surface area here, is 1 upon n. And that's the volume that I need in order to have order 1 points, because the density is n. Okay. So in 2D is 1 upon the square root of n. In d dimensions, by analogy, it is 1 upon the dth root of n. Okay, we cannot do better than the nearest neighbor, in terms of our match cost. But when we are matching, we actually might have some conflicts, right? So these two demand units here, they both have the same nearest neighbor, but they cannot both be matched to the same nearest neighbor. So the match cost might actually be larger than the nearest neighbor distance. And this gap is actually potent, even in a scaling sense. In one dimension, the minimum cost matching actually has a 1 by square root n distance, whereas the nearest neighbor is order 1 upon n away. The reason for this is if you take the left half of the unit interval, it will have a stochastic excess or shortfall of square root n points. Right? So I have to go square root n points away to find the match partner. So this causes this distance to blow up by a factor square root n. Okay, so this is one reason that this nearest neighbor distance may not be achievable. In this case, it's not. But we will think of this as one very simple sort of benchmark to keep in mind, and we will compare what we can achieve with this nearest neighbor distance. Okay, so this is why I've introduced this quantity. There is one more complication because we will have dynamic models of matching. This complication is that we have uncertainty about the future, right? So this demand comes in. Let's say the demands are coming in one at a time, and you have to match them immediately. That supply unit will go away and cannot be used for future demand units, right? So these are my supply units right now. So who should I match this demand unit to? In particular, would you prefer A or B to match this demand unit to? There's a few more to come. Yeah, so this A is, so my transitions are not, or maybe the circle is just not visible, but A is closer than B. So the greedy algorithm would have picked A, but maybe I want to preserve A for future because I might have some demand which comes in the bottom left corner, and it'll be much better off saving A to match with that demand unit. Okay, so I might match with B right now. Okay, so that's a reason that I may not even be able to get down to the static matching cost. Okay, and it's also leading to an algorithmic question of how to do the matching. Okay, that algorithmic question is going to be a little bit in the background for the first part of the talk, but it is there. Okay, so we are going to have, so this is supposed to sort of set up some foundations, right? This initial model, it's not meant to be applied, it's meant to set up a theoretical foundation. So this paper considers 3 models. All of them have some commonality. The supply and demand live in the d-dimensional unit hypercube. They are IID uniform. The cost is always going to be the expected average match distance. They're going to differ basically in the nature of the dynamics. We want to see how the dynamics actually affects us. The first model is going to be just a slight extension of the work going back to the 80s and 90s, where we are just looking at the static matching cost in space. Okay, so we will have n demand units and n plus m supply units. This excess supply, m greater than 0, is where we have an extension over the previous work. It will tell us how much does this matching cost actually, matching constraint, bother us, right? To what extent are we able to get close to the nearest neighbor distance or not, if we don't have any uncertainty about the future. The second model will have demand coming in dynamically, but the supply will be there beforehand. Okay, in all other ways, it's identical to the static model. So now we'll get a sense from this, to what extent does uncertainty about the future make us incur more cost? Okay, what's the best cost achievable here? And the third model will have both sides coming dynamically. And subject to that, it's going to be the simplest model that I could think of. So that simplest model will have at any point in time, little m supply units around in the system. And at every time one demand unit will come, you need to choose whom to match it with. They'll leave, and then one supply unit will come at some independent uniformly random location. So I call that the fully dynamic model. Okay, so now the next part of my talk, I'll just be telling you what are the results that we get for each of these models. So just to summarize, to give you a preview of what I find. So this matching cost, right? It has to be at least the nearest neighbor distance. This is not math, by the way, this is some cartoon. It has to be at least the nearest neighbor distance. The question is, to what extent does it become larger because of the matching constraint? The answer we find is it's small except in one case. And to what extent does it become larger because of the cost of uncertainty about the future? And we find that it's small in all cases. Okay, and by small here I mean something specific. It doesn't change the scaling behavior with the market thickness.
What are you scaling?
So these this n and m, and in this case a little n. Okay, so some thickness parameter.
Is the cost of greedy also small, or
Yeah, so the algorithm that I will show this for is a variant of greedy that I'm able to analyze. There will be a case where we have a logarithmic gap. There's one case in which there's a log factor gap, all other cases it's a constant factor gap. I think that the upper bound is loose and you need a more sophisticated algorithm than greedy to close that gap. Okay, so with that caveat, greedy is enough. Yeah. Okay, so here's another quick summary of the results. So on the left, we have the static and semi-dynamic models. So one nice thing is that they are in the same column. Okay, so that semi-dynamic model, the uncertainty about the future doesn't bother us. So the results are the same. For one dimension, that nearest neighbor distance is not achievable. We already got a preview of that in the static matching, right? Just in the initial warm-up. So that's not achievable, but everywhere else, you can actually get down to the nearest neighbor distance up to a square root log factor in 2 dimensions, up to a constant factor in higher dimensions. This fully dynamic model, where both sides are coming in online, we can actually get down to the nearest neighbor distance even in 1 dimension. So this is something cool to look forward to. Why is this the case, right? Why does this 1D case not bother us? And this actually looks like the 2D case here in a certain sense. Okay, the sort of applied insight that one can try to derive is, where is excess supply helpful to you? Now, if you have already gotten down to the nearest neighbor distance, even a linear excess is only going to give you a constant factor improvement in the nearest neighbor distance. So you don't really need excess supply if you want to. You can't improve the scaling behavior. Okay, so excess supply doesn't help. But in the 1D case, because I'm actually incurring a cost much larger than the nearest neighbor distance, excess supply can help me get the cost down. And this is the phenomenon that is helping us here, is that excess supply helps to smooth out fluctuations, stochastic fluctuations in the quantity of demand at larger length scales. It's not that it's bringing the nearest neighbor closer, it's smoothing out that left half of the interval. The total amount of demand will not exceed the supply, and that is the source of the benefit. In the fully dynamic model, there is a more sort of a mundane kind of phenomenon there, a pedestrian phenomenon, which is that if I have more supply units just hanging around, then obviously the nearest neighbor distance comes down and I can get close to that new nearest neighbor distance. So excess supply helps.
So yes.
Yeah.
Did you already say how M relates to N? Like, are they both like the excess supply? I mean, clearly.
So the first 2 models, the capital M is some arbitrary non-negative thing which is sublinear. It shouldn't be more than linear, and it shouldn't be more than a multiple of capital N, but it can be any scaling with capital N.
But like not a constant, it has to go to infinity.
No, it can be 0. I mean,
Okay.
Yeah.
And the last.
The last one, that is the scaling parameter. The little m is the scaling parameter. The horizon shows up in a secondary way, so I'm kind of hiding that. Think of it as what is the steady state cost. So you need some minimum horizon for the results to kick in, but I'm hiding that.
So what do you mean by both sides arrive dynamically? Like they arrive m at a time.
So M are there. Let's say I initialize the model with M at IIT uniform location, and then a demand unit comes, and then you have to choose one of the supply units to match it to, and then they leave, and then a supply unit comes. So again, I'm back to having M supply units in the system, and this keeps repeating.
So how does this, like if I apply this, I ignore the part of the special part and I apply on the matching test.
So what?
Connection or it's out.
So you're saying I should. Okay, so I will let's talk more about this offline, but I very specifically will use a spatial structure right? I mean, if you want to ignore, you should do greedy. I mean, at least you should do something greedy. Like if you just start matching.
Is it like
Yeah.
because you can get much better guarantees with considering the spatial? Like what's the like knowing the spatial
The type space is already continuous, right? It's not even clear like what's the formulation to apply an online algorithm. Anyway, let's talk more about this offline. See, my comment is the using the spatial geography is very central to understanding the cost and getting near optimal cost behavior. So somehow like these using some black box thing, I am very doubtful that it can be helpful here. So let's talk more about it. Yeah.
Dynamic or are they synchronized to dynamic? Meaning,
Yeah.
two sides that come together or independent, like for example.
Yeah, so I could have done that, but that would have made my life harder. So somebody else can do it.
Issues was what I
Yeah. So this is taking me away from what I was interested in. So I just completely assumed it away in the way I set up the model itself. There's always M supply units in the system.
What Sandy is asking is, at each time, do you have one supply and one demand?
Yeah, yeah.
So two people arrive at each time.
Yeah. So that is by design of the model. You can study other models, but like you do it. I don't want to do it.
So I have a question actually.
Yeah.
That is not my question. So can you go to your results slide? So just
Yeah.
to make sure what.
I mean, the theorems will come up. I mean, I haven't even begun in some sense. Yeah.
So just to make sure I get it right. So what you're saying is the red thing, delta and V are not achievable. Once you have N, you can achieve it. That's what you're saying, right?
Once you have excess supply,
And capital M.
and it's like so you need linear excess if you want to get down to this scaling. You need linear. If you have more than square root, you can start improving upon the case without excess. And I mean you will get 1 upon the excess as the thing you achieve. So we have a thing. So it's going to be that for excess you will get down to 1 upon capital M.
I have one more question. The right column, I did not understand what you said about little m. So you said that N reduces delta and V. How is it possible? Delta and V was this fundamental.
Okay, just hold on. Okay, we will come to this. This is there is some asterisk to even say what is delta and V in that setting. So just hold on for a second. Yeah, I think for this audience is too much introduction because it should be more concrete. This is more like an econ talk. Okay, so we are. So there's a very rich set of papers from the 80s and early 90s on static random spatial matching, which is certainly serving as a foundation here. In terms of online algorithms, Shor's thesis actually has some gems, and that served as a big inspiration. Online bin packing, also spatial matching and stuff from there. That's from that I'm sure. Recently, there's been a bunch of papers inspired by ride hailing, which says I need to maintain some excess supply. Right? Yilun has one of those papers. I need to maintain some excess supply so that when a customer comes in, there is some car in the vicinity that is free, and I don't have to match them to somebody at the other end of town. These are basically some reduced form style models where they don't actually model the details of matching and how the state changes and all of this. This paper slightly predates the one I'm presenting, and they study the one-dimensional semi-dynamic model. I will be specific about what results they found. In that case, excess supply helps, but that's the only case where excess supply helps. So we have to be careful in interpreting that case. Okay, so now let's dive into the models and results. The first two, we are going to have the same result. Okay, so the first one is a static model, and we will see what's the role of the matching constraint. Excess supply. So the model again, I think by now we are quite familiar with the model. So n plus m demand units or supply units, n demand units, everything is present beforehand, and I just want to quantify what is the minimum cost achievable. It is not an algorithmic challenge. Like I know how to do matching, right, efficiently. Question is, what is this minimum cost achievable? How does it scale with n and m? So these are all things known beforehand. This is for the case where there's no excess supply. Okay, so folks work very hard, especially for the 2D case, for 3 and higher dimensions. Talleyrand has a much sharper thing than what I'm showing here. He's characterizing it quite closely. I think the thing to note here, the thing I want you to take away is that for 2 and higher dimensions, you're getting down to the nearest neighbor distance, barring the square root log n factor in the 2D case. Okay, that one is somehow the most interesting, and we'll see why later in the talk. But mathematically, it's sort of the most delicate. The 1D case, you do not get down to the nearest neighbor distance. It's almost as bad as the 2D case. Okay, so my first job was to extend this to the case of excess supply. Okay, so theoretically, not the hardest thing to do, but I was able to get this extension, which basically says that in the 1D case, if I have the excess supply beyond square root n, I actually get the benefit and the cost goes down. Okay, and eventually it's down to the nearest neighbor distance if I have linear excess supply. Yeah.
So what's the intuition for t greater than 3?
Okay, we will come to the intuition. The point is that you can get down to the nearest neighbor distance and higher dimensions. Okay, so we are going out of order, but yes, so in higher dimensions, the surface area is of a ball is quite large. I mean, as the radius of the ball grows, the surface area grows faster than the square root of the volume. Okay, so and in 2D, it's the boundary case where it grows at the same rate, and that's where things get more complex. Okay, so that's really what differentiates d less than 2 and d greater than 2. So bottom line, that matching constraint was only potent in one dimension, and excess supply helps you overcome that. Okay. Now we want to understand the role of uncertainty about the future when you have dynamic arrivals of only the demand side. Okay. So that is our semi-dynamic model. The only change from the static model is the demand units. The demand units come in sequentially and they must be matched immediately upon arrival. It only makes our problem harder. Okay, we need to be careful on how to match as well, even in order to get the positive results on the cost scaling. Okay, this theorem should look familiar, not because you read it, but it's just visually exactly the same. It's only now it's a theorem about the new model. Okay, so the content is in the upper bounds and we are getting exactly the same upper bounds apart from constant factors. Okay. So the bottom line is that you have to pay only at most a constant factor inflation in cost to even though you have uncertainty about the future here compared to the static model. Yes. So there is an algorithm which enables us to prove this stuff. Except for d equal to 2, we are using a variant on greedy. For d equal to 2, this will lead you to have a root log n gap. So we use some other, we sort of use an existing algorithm from Holden, Perez, and Zhang. It's called gravitational matching. But I think, so now Akshit has come up with a few different ways of proving this upper bound, but none of them is greedy. You cannot use greedy.
Is it known that if you use greedy, you'll just strictly worse, or like
for my variant of greedy, I show that. Meaning I can prove that you'll do worse. For greedy itself, like where is Eric? So ask Eric if he can analyze greedy, then maybe he can tell you if it does worse. But he has analyzed it for 1D. Okay, so I don't know how to analyze greedy. Okay, we're going to see Eric's result in a second. So what was known before? So in the 1D case, the 1D semi-dynamic case, with no excess supply, it's obvious that you will have at least a 1 by square root n cost, right? That's true even for the static problem. And there was this paper which had just come out where Akbarpur, Ali Mohammadi, Lee and Saberi, So what they showed is that with linear excess supply, you can bring this cost down to at most log cubed n upon n. And this is what Eric and co-authors actually improved to 1 upon n last week. Okay, but so what we showed is that you can actually get tight upper and lower bounds for this one-dimensional case as a function of m. Okay, it's a visual representation of the theorem I just showed you. Okay, after at a certain point, excess supply actually helps you bring the cost down all the way to the nearest neighbor distance. And then 2 and higher dimensions as well, we have tight bounds, basically the nearest neighbor distance for all of these cases, barring some square root log factor. Okay, so as I have more dimensions, my cost does go up because I am looking for proximity along more dimensions. Right? So for any fixed m, I have a sort of, as d grows, I do have to incur more cost. 1D is the only case where I start at a point which is much above the nearest neighbor distance and excess supply is needed to come down. In all other cases, I don't actually benefit from excess supply. I'm already at a low cost. This third model, this was technically like pretty challenging. So this is where both sides are going to come in dynamically. And we'll see a remarkable phenomenon, right? Somehow that 1D aberration is going to go away. Okay, we will not now have this aberrant case where where you have a much larger cost in one dimension than the nearest neighbor distance that comes up. Okay, so this again our model has the same spatial distributions. This time we are going to maintain little m supply units in the system at any time by definition of the model. And these challenge is going to be that when I match a supply unit, that supply unit disappears and the new supply unit comes at a uniformly random location. But my state is not MIID uniformly located supplies because what's left is a function of how I was doing the matching in the past. So this distribution can get skewed and this can inflate my costs going forward. Okay. So what is the meaning of nearest neighbor distance here? Because I don't even have a handle on the state. I mean, that's the thing I struggle to do and to prove things, right? But we're going to just take an optimistic nearest neighbor distance. So I give you the superpower that you can reposition all supply units at every period before you see where the demand unit is coming in. So maybe you'll put it at evenly spaced locations or some even smarter version than that. And how far apart will they be? That grid will have this granularity, which is 1 upon the dth root of little m. So certainly I cannot do better than this. How close can I get to this? That's the question. Okay. The first result is that in one dimension, you can't get down to 1 upon m. In fact, you can't get down below log m upon m. This actually is by reduction to the two-dimensional spatial static matching problem of Ajtai, Kumlosh and Tushnari. Because we start getting a sense that somehow this time is acting like an additional spatial dimension. Right? So we have a lower bound, but there's only a log m gap between that and the nearest neighbor distance. Is it tight? The question is still open, but you can actually achieve log squared m upon m. I've shown that there's an algorithm which gives you almost the nearest neighbor distance in one dimension for long enough horizons, right? Okay, so let's not focus on this this little thing. For D2 and higher, you can get down to that optimistic nearest neighbor distance to within a constant factor. Okay, so somehow the d-dimensional case in this fully dynamic model is acting like the d plus 1th dimensional case in the static model. Okay, I won't go too much deeper into this, but time gives us, we can do some averaging over time in this situation where both supply and demand are coming in dynamically.
Do you think you can use the coupling to get for some log m over m is the right answer?
So I think log m over m is the right answer. It shouldn't be obvious to you at this point, but I don't think it should be. But yes, I think this is the right answer, and greedy cannot get this. Like I'm sure greedy cannot get this, but I think greedy gives you log m to the 3 halves. I've proved only log n square, but I think there's a different algorithm which should come from some of Shor's bin packing ideas. It manages different length scales and allows for cancellation between them, and that should make this achievable. Okay, hard problem, but nice open problem. Yeah. Perfect. Yeah. So this scaling just turns out is problem.
Yeah, that's
Yeah. Got it. Yeah.
This is all for uniform distributions, right?
Yeah.
Is there anything at all like known for more general, like even some of these cases, like more general distributions?
But the distribution density is bounded below and above by some constants. Everything applies.
Sure.
Um,
But in terms of the nearest neighbor, like the expected nearest neighbor distance.
so again, scaling will not be affected under the assumption that I described,
Okay.
because that's a constant factor.
Sure.
Okay? That's what I can say right now. If you have these tails and stuff, then that will change. So hopefully the nearest neighbor distance is something you can get a handle on, and then hopefully the translations are going to be similar to what we found. Yeah.
I didn't get when you said that it behaves like d plus 1 dimension, time is extra dimension, because the scaling 1 over n power 1 over d looks like what it was in
Yeah, so you've mapped it in a way that doesn't work. I think so. This, if you think about where, in what situations can I get down close to the nearest neighbor distance? Right? I mean, there is going to be a distance on the time axis, but that doesn't contribute to our cost. So at that point, the mapping doesn't work. There, it's also, don't take it too literally. Like this is the closest. The formal connection is only this lower bound. Actually using the 2D lower bound, 2D static lower bound to prove this. Other than that, it's some intuition. It's not a perfect analogy. Yeah.
If like I have the motivation of a rider sharing systems, it's like is the supply, the uniform distribution of supply optimal when the demand is uniform? Like what would be the optimal supply distribution?
Yeah, I think that's close to. I mean,
Even if you have surplus like this M.
yeah. So actually, you want to make sure that it's well spread out. You have to have a spread. So let's say I want to make sure that my pickup distances are small. So somehow the relocation of supply should be such that the distribution, like over some time horizon, should be the distribution of the relocated position of the driver should be the same as the demand distribution up to those pickup distances. And then, so that is just like just to maintain the steady state. Now you also want to keep a little excess everywhere. So you want to dynamically manage and make sure that there are cars in all neighborhoods. Like this is actually important. Yeah.
Couldn't there be some boundary effects in this case? I mean, like with boundaries like speed or whatnot, like, yeah, sure.
Yeah. So these things are probably going to get washed away in the constant factors. If you like toruses, you can think about the torus. Yeah.
I'm thinking about the modeling. So
Yeah.
you have this n guys that are just sitting, right? I mean, I know you're matching the, let's say, flux, but the m people that is sitting.
Yeah.
So instead, you could have a dynamic model where you could do some kind of batching. So you wait until you have 100 people, then you match and keep repeating it.
Good. Yeah. So this batching, if I have a batch which consists of only order m demand units or fewer, then the scaling results are unchanged. So your batch size will have to be larger than the number of supply units sitting around. This, by the way, is not the regime for normal ride hailing. Like maybe for like this ride share, which now is not very popular, right, after COVID. But when you want to pair customers, then they might make you guys wait for longer. But the regime is not that you make people wait for so long that the pool thickness increases enough to change the scaling. I mean, that's a lot. It might change some constant factor. Yeah, I guess that connects up with some of our conversations.
Is the independent arrival assumption question?
Independent locations across time. I would think yes. Yes. Then you will need a lot of correlation again to change the scaling, but yeah, if it's there, then it's a problem. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to give a quick set of intuition. I want you to focus on the picture. There's a bunch of text. I think with the time that I have, I want you to just focus on the pictures. So where are these results coming from? Okay, so this intuition, this is how I think about these problems, and I think you can try to get some of this even if you missed some of the results I was telling you so far. Think about the static model or the semi-dynamic model. What we want to do is to understand what's happening in d dimension, that length scale L for every L, starting from the nearest neighbor distance and going up to the macro distance. Okay, so for any L in this interval, I can look at a unit hypercube and I can ask, what is the how large can the stochastic fluctuations in the amount of demand in there be, right? And if let's say I have no excess supply, that stochastic fluctuation can go against me, and it might be I have more demand than supply here. How much more? It's square root of n times the volume. Okay, some basic calculation. And if that's the case, I need to go outside to find enough supply to match all the demand inside. How far outside? So that's like surface area times this delta times n. This should be the amount of excess demand that I'm compensating for. Okay, so I have to compare the square root of the volume and the surface area of this side length L hypercube. And this tells me how large this delta can have to be. I call this the barrier to matching at length scale L. So you can compute this as a function of this D and as a function of L, right? And this picture basically tells us what's happening. On the x-axis, I have this length scale L. On the y-axis, I have this barrier to matching, right? In 1D, the macro barrier to matching is the most dominant one. So what do I need to do to match those in the left half of the unit interval? That's what my main challenge is. In 2D, all length scales have the same barrier to matching. It's of the same scale, same order. So that's where these funky logarithmic factors show up, like the square root of log. That's why greedy fails. It doesn't take into account cancellations between different length scales. For 3 and higher dimensions, the nearest neighbor distance, so the micro length scale is the one that dominates. The hardest thing is to find the nearest neighbor. Other length scales don't bother me. Somehow the surface area of larger balls is large enough that I just go a little bit more and I can find lots of options and figure things out. This isoparametric type of thinking is actually, for me, very helpful. Okay, and this type of thinking also tells us what's the benefit of excess supply. It kind of gets rid of the problem at the larger length scales because it dominates the stochastic fluctuations at those larger length scales. Okay, so this is the intuition that I wanted to make sure I convey. In the fully dynamic model, somehow time acts like an additional spatial dimension. So even the 1D case acts like the 2D case in the pictures that I showed you. And we don't have this problem at the longer length scales. The algorithm is that I've used to prove most of these results is a variant on greedy that I could analyze. So it consists of basically taking the unit hypercube, subdividing it into child hypercubes by cutting each side length in half, and you keep doing this until you get down to the nearest neighbor distance length scale. Okay, and then you try to match within the same leaf hypercube. But if there's no supply, you go up to the one of the sibling hypercubes, and if that doesn't work, you go up to one of the first cousin hypercubes. So you're kind of decomposing this way the cost across the different length scales, and in fact, the cost at each level of this hierarchy is of the same order as the barrier to matching at that length scale. Okay, so that's pretty much the intuition for the semi-dynamic model. For the fully dynamic model, it's a little bit more involved.
So in some sense, the intuition behind barrier to the dimension is like the increase in the objective with amount that you have to relax to make the constraint, like that conversion is very favorable. You have to relax just a little bit.
Yeah. Okay, good.
From constraint to objective.
Yes, I think that sounds like good intuition. I would have to think a little more, but it sounds like. So Ilan has this nice paper where they kind of assume that the nearest neighbor distance is achievable in 2D, something like the fully dynamic model. And we have shown that actually that's the case. And so now it sort of makes it even more solid that this is how you should do your capacity plan, okay, which was the point of that. Okay, so bottom line, we understood well here the case where the supply and demand distributions are same and the nearest neighbor distance is almost always achievable. Okay, so now we want to take this and move forward. By the way, there are nice open problems here, which I will skip over for now, but happy to talk about these offline or maybe tomorrow if there's room in your session.
Definitely.
Yes.
Okay, there are many open problems.
Yes.
Okay. So now we want to understand something closer to the application, and one key difference is going to be that demand and supply distributions are not same, right? So we will look at application motivated models which have this feature, and also will allow the match cost to not just be the distance but maybe some power of the distance. We will see that the power 2 comes up naturally in one of the models. And this already basically eliminates hierarchical greedy as a candidate because it's matching some people at long distances and not paying a heavy price. So now it's not going to give you good scaling behavior. Okay, so we will look at, there'll be 2 papers that I'll breeze through now, and both of them will be the semi-dynamic model, which I think is more relevant except for ride hailing. Ride hailing, I think the equal distributions thing is not too bad. Okay, so we talked about why a little bit, but for other applications, I think the semi-dynamic model is probably closer to the reality, and we will be looking at p equal to 2. It will turn out that's what comes out naturally in these slightly more applied models. So first, let's look at a model inspired a little bit by matching platforms. It's going to have smooth spatial distributions, not the same as each other. The match value will be the inner product of the demand point and the supply point. And we will now need to really think about how to do the matching. You can't do it greedily. It's going to give us very poor performance. So this is inspired. This is with Yilun, Chen and Akshit Kumar. It's inspired by these matching platforms. So let's think of lodging, right? So you have listings, they have some attributes. Let's think of 2, price and distance to downtown. And let's say the customers have sensitivities to the price and to the distance to downtown. Okay, and each customer has their own sensitivity. Let's model the match value as the inner product between the sensitivity vector and the attribute vector. Okay. Once you have put in this minus sign, you want to maximize this inner product. And this maximizing this inner product in a setting where I have n demand units and n supply units, no excess supply, is equivalent to minimizing the squared distance. It's a simple calculation. So we are back to minimizing distance, but now we are minimizing the squared distance. Okay. There's no reason demand and supply distributions should be the same. They even have different interpretations. So we will allow these 2 to be different.
So does this max mean also when you approximate?
When you are approximate,
let's say now we turn it into a maximization question.
Yeah.
And we have a 2 approximation, like you get 1/2 of opt. What does that imply for the minimization?
So I'm not looking for approximation.
Okay.
I will be looking for the additive regret.
Okay.
Yeah.
Also, is there a reason for the square other than the mathematical cleanliness? I mean, the square seems like a somewhat random.
So this the inner product, they use this in recommendation systems. Like in the theory that has been developed for recommendation system, they'll use this inner product utility.
Sure.
So then the square comes out from that. It certainly helps us, right? So one of the open problems is going to be what if it's not 2 and some other power and we don't know how to handle it. But we don't feel too bad about the inner product.
Okay.
Fair enough. Okay, so now all of us are sleepy, so one more riddle for you. So I have a demand distribution which is uniform between 0 and half, and I have a supply distribution which is uniform between half and 1. So what is the optimal transport which will maximize the expected inner product between the demand point and the supply point? Yeah, perfect. Java has it right. So it's just taking each point and matching it to half plus that point. Now, if I use a greedy algorithm, and by the way,
Sorry, yes.
yeah.
What are the vectors out here? Sorry, I didn't go.
So it's a 1D case. So the vector, it's a scalar. So I'm just trying to maximize the average product between the demand location and the supply location, or the demand value and the supply value. Yeah, sorry, I should have mentioned it's a one-dimensional case.
We are sleepy, sorry.
Yeah, I understand. I think I was yesterday at UIUC at this workshop, and one of my co-authors gave the post-lunch talk, and I slept through like half of it.
You are on camera, by the way.
No, I mean she saw me, so I think it doesn't get worse. Okay. So this is the optimal transport. Now, if you think about actual matching platform which doesn't do the matching, like Airbnb or Upwork, they are trying to give each person like the best quality recommendations, as though they are running like Netflix, right? That Netflix can have the same movie watched by everybody, but these guys have a matching constraint. But like their default is they will just make recommendations without looking at the matching constraint. So this means you are doing a greedy match, you're doing a uniformly random matching. Effectively, if your demand is coming in a uniformly random order, and in this case there's maybe a 10% gap, so it could be a 50% gap. Okay, I won't claim more than 50 because I haven't checked, but it can be a pretty big gap. Okay, so we need to use the optimal transport and stuff I'll not cover now, but Yilun and Akshit have done a great job with it. There are two other key elements that need to go into an algorithm which can achieve the right regret scaling and the optimal regret scaling, and regret here is how far I fall short of the fluid optimal transport value additively. So these two other elements, they call it symmetrization and online fair allocation. So this means that their algorithm for identical distribution is doing a much better job than hierarchical greedy. It's matching everybody to somebody close by as opposed to matching some people at a distance. Okay, so I won't go into what they have done. But bottom line is that they are able to probably achieve the best regret scaling. And by the way, this thing is like the square of the nearest neighbor distance, except in the 1D case, where it's the square of that other quantity that came up, 1 by square root n. So we're getting basically the same type of result with, again, those same those caveats that Anupam brought up. We are not able to do this analysis for p not equal to 2. It's a nice problem. We don't know even algorithmically how to proceed when there's excess supply, and we need this fair matching type of thing. Nice problem. Okay, I don't even know how to approach it. I don't even have a heuristic. And then for these platforms, they need to decentralize the solution. They need to know how to make recommendations. They don't control the matching. There could be incentive issues. There could be other kinds of issues. Maybe the customers have choice probabilities. Very nice, I think, question or set of questions there. I wanted to talk a little bit about revenue management. So this is work with Omar Bezbaz and Akshit Kumar. So this actually is also, it can be viewed as a semi-dynamic model question, but now in revenue management, right, it's as though your supply distribution is atomic. Okay, and we are going to see what if your demand distribution is smooth, like the kinds of distribution we've looked at so far, and what if it's lumpy. Okay, and we are going to come up with a new algorithmic insight to solve the problem when the demand distribution is also lumpy. So okay, this is the multi-secretary problem. Okay, so I have a sequence of n secretaries with abilities drawn from some distribution f, and each time I have to make an irrevocable higher or not decision, and I have a capacity of B secretaries I can hire. I want to get the largest sum of abilities, right, in the people that I hire. Okay, so the standard, it's a revenue management problem. The standard policy is certainty equivalent with resolving. Okay, so this is a special case of optimal transport, but you recompute it after each arrival. To see how much budget is remaining, how many people are going to come in, you recompute the threshold. So there's some threshold. So this
is known distribution.
Known distribution, yes, known distribution. Okay, so this is going to give some constant or logarithmic regret both for atomic distribution as well as for smooth distribution like uniform 0, 1. But one of the first things we show is that if you have a continuous distribution but with a gap like this regret of this policy can be square root n. So even optimal transport is resolving optimal transport is not enough. It was enough if you had a smooth distribution of demand, but only the supply was lumpy. It had atoms, but not enough when both sides are lumpy. And we introduce a principle we call conservativeness with respect to gaps here, which basically says that if my threshold is close to the gap from the optimal transport, and I compute that there's a risk that I will hire some low value secretaries, and in future I will have to turn down some high value secretaries, let me avoid this risk. Let me just use the gap itself as the threshold. Let me reject low value secretaries as long as this risk persists. So this is important, and we are able to get the optimal regret scaling in various under various sets of assumptions. That was what I wanted to say. There are some open problems here as well. Most importantly, the multi-dimensional version of this. Multi-secretary is a one-dimensional problem, and Akshit has been working hard on this. Maybe this warrants more than one paper though. It's a hard problem. Okay, so just to wrap up now. So we've done these scaling characterizations. This is regret. We are able to bring it down to the nearest neighbor distance in all except that one aberrant case. We gave algorithmic insights, and this actually there's a sort of nice high level picture forming as well. If you have different distributions of demand and supply, you cannot use greedy. You need to use the optimal transport. If both of them are smooth, you can use a static optimal transport. If it's like revenue management where the supply distribution is atomic, right, but the demand distribution is smooth, you can use a dynamic optimal transport, the resolving certainty equivalent policy. If both sides are lumpy, you have to use an additional this conservativeness with respect to gaps type of thing that we found. Lots of open problems of both theoretical as well as applied interest. Okay, you survived. End of the day, I mean, end of talk.
Your question about you mentioned about right? The other thing I can think of is just distance, but instead of L2 distance using L3 distance. Does it change?
So it's a constant factor for any thing.
So it's constant that depends on T.
Even elements, yeah. So we don't care about the constant dependence on B. I mean, I do, but that was one of my open problems. So I think that you should be able to get down to within 1 plus little O of one of the nearest neighbor distance in high dimension.
Okay.
Because you just need a little more. That shell has so much volume, it should be enough. So nice open problem. I don't know how to do it.
And that is what you meant by the sharp characterization.
Yeah. Correct. So in the static thing, he's able to analyze it. The dynamics. I don't think he knows either. I got much of the inspiration from this was like various email conversations with Talent, but I don't think he has any idea how to do that. The dynamics.
We'll take a short break and see upstairs the second floor. We can at roughly 3:30.
But those who have posters had earlier and said